There is a townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that, by every conventional measure of luxury real estate, should have been one of the most desirable properties in the world. 7 floors, 40 rooms, over 21,000 square feet. A prestigious address on East 71st Street, steps from Central Park, in one of the wealthiest and most coveted neighborhoods on earth. It was listed at $88 million. And for a long time, almost nobody would touch it. Not because of the building, not because of the location, not because of anything a structural engineer or an appraiser would find, but because of what had happened inside those walls, and because of whose name would forever be attached to that address. This is the story of 9 East 71st Street, and what the market did and didn't do when it went up for sale. Let's start with what this property actually was. Because before everything else, before the headlines, before the courtrooms, before the name, there was a building, and the building was extraordinary. 9 East 71st Street is one of the largest private townhouses in all of Manhattan. That's not marketing language. In a city where square footage is the most valuable commodity in the world, having 21,000 square feet of private residential space in a single structure is genuinely remarkable. 7 floors, 40 rooms, a facade of pale limestone that has anchored the corner of that block for over a century. By the standards of Manhattan real estate, by the standards of any real estate, this was among the finest private addresses in existence. Jeffrey Epstein acquired this property in 1989. And the way he got it is itself a detail that tells you something about who he was. The house was transferred to him by Les Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, the company behind Victoria's Secret and other major retail chains. At the time, Wexner was one of the wealthiest men in America and one of Epstein's most prominent financial connections. The transfer price, according to public records, was effectively nothing. One of the most valuable pieces of private real estate in Manhattan, changing hands for what amounted to a token sum. Wexner would later say he had been defrauded by Epstein, that he was manipulated, that the relationship was not what he believed it to be. But in 1989, the townhouse passed to Jeffrey Epstein, and it would remain his for 30 years. Over the decades, Epstein transformed the interior of the townhouse into something that occupied a strange space between extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable. Investigators, journalists, and law enforcement who entered the building after his arrest described interiors that were lavish, unusual, and in certain areas, profoundly disturbing. Grand formal rooms, an extensive art collection, custom installations, spaces designed for entertainment on a scale most private residences never approach. But also, and this is where the building's story becomes impossible to separate from everything else, evidence of what had actually been happening inside those walls. Evidence that was central to one of the most serious criminal cases in recent American history. The house was not just a home. Investigators made clear that it had been a location, a setting, part of the operation, and that fact would follow the building wherever it went next. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey upon returning from Paris on his private jet. The charges were federal: sex trafficking of minors, conspiracy. The arrest sent shockwaves through some of the most powerful social and financial circles in the world. Because Epstein had not lived quietly. His connections to politicians, royalty, financiers, academics, celebrities were extensive and well documented. And now all of it was under a federal spotlight. His properties were immediately part of that scrutiny. The Manhattan townhouse, a Palm Beach estate, an island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a ranch in New Mexico. All of it, suddenly, was connected to a federal investigation into crimes against children. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. He had been awaiting trial. He died before it began. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide by hanging. That ruling has been contested by Epstein's lawyers and disputed by independent forensic analysts. It remains a source of intense public debate. But whatever the circumstances of his death, the legal consequences did not disappear with him. Civil suits continued. Federal investigations into his associates continued. And his estate, his properties, his assets, his holdings, passed into the hands of administrators tasked with liquidating what remained, including 9 East 71st Street. When the administrators of Epstein's estate turned their attention to the Manhattan townhouse, they faced a problem that had no real precedent in the luxury real estate market. The property itself was impeccable. The location was among the finest in the world. The size was almost unmatched in private Manhattan real estate. On every technical measure, this was a trophy asset. The kind of property that appears on the market perhaps once in a generation. But attached to it was something no renovation could remove, no redesign could eliminate, no amount of time could fully erase. A name, a story, a documented history of what had taken place inside those rooms. And the question the estate's administrators had to answer was one that real estate had almost never had to confront at this scale. How do you sell a property when the property itself has become evidence? In 2020, the estate listed 9 East 71st Street for $88 million. That price reflected what the property should have been worth based on its size, location, condition, and the comparable sales market on the Upper East Side. By the logic of Manhattan luxury real estate, $88 million was not unreasonable. In fact, for a private townhouse of that scale in that location, some would have argued it was conservative. The listing went public. The real estate world took note. And then the silence began. Because the buyers who could afford $88 million for a Manhattan townhouse were also buyers with reputations, with boards of directors, with families, with social circles that overlapped in some cases with the very world that Epstein had occupied. And none of them wanted their name on that deed. Real estate professionals have a term for what happened to this property. They call it stigmatized real estate. A stigmatized property is one where the value has been impacted, not by any physical defect, but by events or associations connected to the property. A high-profile crime, a tragedy, a name that carries damage too severe for the market to absorb. Most stigmatized properties deal with this at much lower price points. A house where something violent occurred, a building associated with a local scandal. The Epstein townhouse was stigmatized real estate at a scale the industry had almost no framework for. Because the events in question were not local. They were global. documented by federal prosecutors, covered by every major news outlet in the world, permanently embedded in the public record. And the address, 9 East 71st Street, was part of that record. So here is where things stood when this property entered the market. One of the finest private addresses in Manhattan, nearly $90 million in asking price. A physical building that was, by every technical standard, a masterpiece of private urban real estate. And surrounding it, invisible to any camera, uncapturable in any listing photo, a story so severe, so globally documented, so permanently attached to that address, that the pool of willing buyers had effectively collapsed. The question wasn't whether the house was worth $88 million. The question was whether any amount of money could make the right buyer willing to put their name on it. To understand why this property struggled, you need to understand who actually buys an $88 million Manhattan townhouse. This is not a transaction made by anonymous individuals. At that price point, buyers are known. Their purchases are tracked by real estate media, filed in public property records, discussed in the circles where that kind of wealth moves. In other words, there is no such thing as a quiet, private purchase of an $88 million Manhattan property. The buyer's name goes on the deed. The deed is a public document. And the address, in this case, was the most reported real estate address in the world. So the buyer pool wasn't just wealthy individuals. It was wealthy individuals willing to absorb the reputational consequences of owning that specific building at that specific address at that specific moment in history. That pool was very, very small. One of the first questions serious buyers raised was this: could the interior be completely transformed? Could you gut the building, remove every surface, every installation, every room that had been shaped by Epstein's decades of occupancy, and replace it with something entirely new? Something with no visual connection to what had been there before? The answer, technically, was yes. A full gut renovation of a building like this is expensive but possible. The limestone facade and the structural bones would remain. Everything else could theoretically be replaced. But here's the problem with that logic. You can replace the floors. You can replace the walls. You can replace every fixture and finish inside that building. You cannot replace the address. You cannot replace the history embedded in the public record. And you cannot make the world forget that 9 East 71st Street was part of a federal criminal case. Let's be direct about something that real estate professionals discussed privately but rarely said out loud. Some potential buyers had the money. Some had the appetite for a complex purchase. Some were genuinely interested in what the building could become after a full renovation. But almost all of them ran the same calculation eventually. What happens at my next board meeting when someone mentions where I live? What happens when my children's school does a public donor list and my address appears? What happens when a journalist runs a story and my name appears next to that address in a Google search that will exist forever? At $88 million, you are not buying privacy. You are buying a very public statement about who you are and what you are willing to be associated with. And for the overwhelming majority of buyers who could afford it, the answer was no. For the administrators managing Epstein's estate, this was not an abstract question about reputation. It was a practical financial problem with a deadline. The estate had obligations, legal costs, civil settlements, ongoing expenses tied to properties that were sitting unsold and generating no income while continuing to cost money every month. The townhouse had to sell. The question was not if. It was at what price, and to whom, and when. And every month that passed without a buyer was another month of carrying costs, legal fees, and a listing that was accumulating something almost as damaging as stigma: time on market. Because in luxury real estate, a listing that has been available for a long time starts to generate its own questions, its own doubts, its own additional reasons for buyers to hesitate. Eventually, a buyer emerged, a real estate developer, someone in the business of looking at buildings as physical assets, structures to be acquired, transformed, and repositioned. Someone whose calculation was, by professional necessity, somewhat different from the social calculation most buyers were running. The price was approximately $51 million. Against an $88 million asking price, that's a discount of roughly $37 million. $37 million in value. Evaporated not because of any structural defect, not because of flood risk or maintenance costs or zoning issues, but because of a name, because of what that name meant, because of what had happened inside a building that was physically as close to perfect as Manhattan real estate gets. The developer who purchased the townhouse had a specific kind of logic available to them that individual buyers did not. When you are a development entity, a company, a legal structure, the reputational calculus is different. You are not putting your personal name on a dinner party conversation. You are making a business decision about a physical asset. And the physical asset, stripped of everything attached to it, was genuinely remarkable. The bones of the building were extraordinary. The location was irreplaceable. At $51 million, with a full renovation factored in. There was a case to be made that this was still a rational investment. That doesn't mean it was easy, or comfortable, or without risk. But it was a calculation a professional developer could make in a way that an individual buyer almost could not. Here's what the developer could change. The interiors, gone. Custom installations, removed. Every surface that carried any visual connection to the property's previous occupant, stripped, replaced, redesigned. A full renovation of this scale can genuinely produce something that looks and feels entirely new. New materials, new layouts, new identity. But here's what no renovation can touch. The address, the public records, the news articles, hundreds of them, published by outlets in every language, that permanently associate 9 East 71st Street with the Epstein case. 20 years from now, a Google search of that address will return the same results it returns today. The renovation changes the inside of the building. It does not change the internet. And that is a new kind of real estate problem, one the industry had never really had to solve before. The Manhattan townhouse was not the only Epstein property that the estate had to sell. There was a Palm Beach estate, where the original 2008 case had been centered, where the first legal proceedings had taken place. There was Little St. James, the private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands that had become one of the most reported locations in the entire case. There was a ranch in New Mexico, an apartment in Paris, Each property carried its own version of the same problem. The Palm Beach estate was demolished before sale, literally torn down, the physical building removed because no buyer would purchase it standing. The island was sold under similarly difficult circumstances. Demolition. That's what the stigma produced. Not just a price reduction, not just a difficult negotiation. The complete physical removal of a building because the building's existence had become commercially untenable. When you step back from the specifics of this case and look at what the market was communicating, the message is clear. The $37 million discount on the Manhattan townhouse was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. The market was saying, "We will absorb this asset. We will find a use for this physical structure. But we will not pay what it would have been worth without this history attached to it. We will price the stigma in." And the stigma, in this case, cost $37 million. That number has a kind of brutal honesty to it. It tells you exactly what the market believed one of the most documented criminal reputations in modern history was worth. In dollars, attached to a building, on a deed that would be a public record forever. $37 million. That was the price of the name. So the sale happened at $51 million to a developer, with plans to gut the interior and start again. In some narrow sense, the market had worked. An asset had found a price. A buyer had been found. The estate had moved closer to resolution. But the gap between $88 million and $51 million was not a negotiation outcome. It was a measure of damage that no renovation could fully repair. And the deeper question, the one this building forces you to sit with, is whether any price is really enough to account for what happened here. Whether the market's tools are even the right tools for a situation like this. Because what happened at 9 East 71st Street was not a real estate problem at its core. It was a human problem. And real estate was just where part of the accounting took place. Real estate stigma is not a new concept. Properties associated with tragedy, crime, or scandal have always faced market penalties. But what happened to 9 East 71st Street was different in scale and kind from almost anything the industry had seen before. The typical stigmatized property, a house where something violent occurred, a building with a local reputation, tends to recover value over time. As memories fade, as ownership changes, as years pass without incident, the stigma loses its grip on the market. But the Epstein case did not fade. It expanded. Federal investigations continued after his death. Civil suits multiplied. Books, documentaries, congressional hearings. The story grew rather than shrank in the years following his arrest. And with every new development in the case, the address that appeared in every story remained the same. There is a real estate concept called the statute of limitations on stigma. The idea that over time, markets forget. That a property's association with a negative event fades from active memory, and the price penalty gradually disappears. That concept was developed before the internet became the permanent public archive it is today. Because what Google has done to stigma is eliminate the statute of limitations entirely. Every article, every court document, every photograph taken outside that building in July 2019 when federal agents were present, every headline, every broadcast clip, every documentary segment, all of it is permanently indexed, permanently searchable, permanently attached to that address in a way that would have been impossible 20 or 30 years ago. A buyer in 2030 who searches that address will find the same results a buyer found in 2020. And a buyer in 2040 will find the same results again. The internet has made stigma permanent in a way that real estate has never had to fully reckon with until now. There's a dimension of this story that rarely gets discussed in the coverage of the sale. The neighbors. 9 East 71st Street is surrounded by some of the most expensive private residences in Manhattan. The people who live on that block paid extraordinary amounts for their addresses. For the quiet, the prestige, the sense of being in one of the most exclusive and private urban environments in the world. And then, for months and then years, their block was a location in a global news story. News cameras on the sidewalk, investigators entering and leaving, the address mentioned in broadcasts in dozens of languages. Your property's value is partially a function of what surrounds it. And what surrounded these properties, for an extended period, was one of the most reported criminal cases in modern American history. Let's sit with the number for a moment. $51 million. That is still an extraordinary sum of money for a private residence. In almost any context, in almost any city in the world, $51 million for a single building would be a record-setting transaction. But context is everything in real estate. And in the context of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where comparable private townhouses of that size transact at prices that would have put this building closer to $80, $90, or even $100 million in a normal sale. $51 million represents something very specific. It represents what the market believed was a fair price for an extraordinary property burdened by an extraordinary problem. And that discount, $37 million below asking, is not a negotiating outcome. It is a market signal, clear, precise, and final. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes were seeking justice through the civil courts long after his death. And the estate's assets, including the proceeds from the sale of 9 East 71st Street, were part of the financial landscape from which settlements were drawn. That's a dimension of this story that gets lost in the real estate analysis. The $51 million transaction wasn't just a market outcome. It was, in part, a source of funds for people who had been genuinely harmed. People for whom the value of this building, whatever it ultimately was, had a very different kind of meaning. Real estate is usually just real estate. Numbers on a document, an asset changing hands. This was something more complicated. And the $37 million that vanished between asking price and sale price was, in one sense, money that was no longer available to those settlements. Stigma has victims too. And they are not always obvious ones. After the sale closed, the developer began the process of transforming the building. A full gut renovation, every interior surface removed. The building stripped to its structural skeleton and rebuilt from the inside out. New floors, new walls, new layouts, new mechanical systems, new everything. The goal, explicit or not, was to produce something that bore no visual relationship to what had existed before, to make the building new, to give it a future that was not defined by its past. And in a narrow physical sense, that's achievable. The bones of the building, the limestone facade, the floors, the height, the address, those remain, Everything else can be replaced. Whether that's enough to fully separate a property from its history is a question no renovation has ever been able to fully answer. What this case introduces to real estate, quietly, without fanfare, is a question the industry is still trying to answer. In an era of permanent digital records, how do you price stigma? The old models assumed stigma faded. That time was a solvent that dissolved reputational damage, that the market would eventually return to seeing a property for what it was physically, rather than what it had been historically. Those models were built for a world before permanent search indexes, before global news coverage that never expires, before a reality in which the history of a building is one Google search away for any buyer. Forever. The Epstein townhouse forced the market to confront a version of stigma that doesn't fade. And the price, a $37 million discount on one of the finest private residences in Manhattan, tells you exactly how seriously the market took that confrontation. 9 East 71st Street still stands. The limestone facade is unchanged. The arched windows still look out onto the same quiet block they have looked onto for over a century. The building is still one of the largest private structures in Manhattan. Whatever the renovation produced inside, whatever new identity the developer built within those walls, the address is the same. And the address carries everything. In real estate, there's a saying: you can change everything about a property except its location. For most properties, that's a comment about geography, about neighborhood, about proximity to parks and transport and the things that make a location desirable. For 9 East 71st Street, it means something else entirely. It means that the history embedded in that address, the public record, the court documents, the news coverage, the permanent digital archive, is as unchangeable as the limestone it's written on. So here is the question that 9 East 71st Street leaves behind. Is there a price at which you would buy it? Think about it carefully, because this is not a theoretical exercise. The building is extraordinary. The location is among the finest in the world. The renovation has, physically, removed everything visible from its previous life. But the address is the same. The records are the same. The search results are the same. And your name, if you purchased it, would appear on a deed at that address in a public document forever. Is there a number that makes that acceptable? And if so, what does that number tell you about what a reputation is actually worth? Because the market already answered that question. It said the number was $37 million. That was the cost of the name. The only question left is whether you would have agreed. There is a version of this story where 9 East 71st Street is simply a building, stone and steel and glass, rooms and floors and windows, an address on a quiet block in one of the greatest cities in the world, a building that cost extraordinary money to acquire, to maintain, to sell. That changed hands through one of the most complicated and painful estate transactions in recent American history, that was renovated and repositioned and sent back into the market as something new. That version of the story is clean. It has a beginning and an end. But there is another version, the one that sits underneath the numbers and the transactions and the listing prices, the one that asks what a place absorbs when something terrible happens inside it. Whether a building can truly be separated from its history. Whether the market's tools, price, discount, renovation, resale are adequate to account for what actually occurred. 9 East 71st Street was sold. The accounting was done. The estate was settled. But some questions don't close when the deal does.